How do you replace a player like Jude Bellingham? That is what today's video is all about. Welcome to Sensible Transfers. What we're going to do is we're going to have a look at the Borussia Dortmund squad. We're going to find weaknesses in that squad and we're going to suggest some sensible solutions from within the transfer market. Now, we're not interested in rumour. We are not interested in conjecture. All we want is smart solutions that can fix these problems on the pitch. So without further ado, let's take a look at Borussia Dortmund. Now, if you look at the Borussia Dortmund squad, you can see that they have a decent amount of depth all over the pitch. If you look at the centre-back area, you'll see there's only 3 viable options, but they are all good options, so we're not too worried about that area. But then another area in the back line that stands out to me is the fullback area, particularly on the left-hand side. Now, they've just brought in Rami Bensebaini from Borussia Mönchengladbach to replace Rafael Guerreiro, who has left on a free, and then they have Nico Schulz backing him up as well. Now, Bensebaini is 28 years old, Schulz is 30 years old, so they do have a bit of a problem here. Schulz isn't really going to play, you would think, at all, and so that means that they don't really have a huge amount of backup in this area. Now, Julian Ryerson has played as a left-back for chunks of this season, but you also want to make sure that you've got backup in the right-back area, because Thomas Meunier is also not going to play very much this season. So what you would expect to see is Wolf being backed up by Ryerson, and then maybe if you brought in a younger profile of player behind Bensebaini, you could use him as a medium-term option who would eventually replace him in the long run. So in terms of the practicalities, then we're looking for young players with a decent ceiling who'd be happy starting out on the bench and fighting for a place in the starting 11. So I've got 3 options here, and I think they're all quite exciting in very different ways. They're all attacking profiles, but they do all attack in different manners. The first one is Manu Sanchez, who is an Atletico Madrid player, just coming off the back of a really good loan period at Osasuna. And another player who's similar is Jan Matsen, who's currently a Chelsea player, but you may have heard of him from his time at Burnley under Vincent Kompany. Now, Jan Matsen is a similar attacking profile to someone like Manu Sanchez, and like Sanchez, he's also had a really good loan spell, which suggests that he would be ready to make the step up. He's also unlikely to make the Chelsea matchday squad anytime soon, and so maybe a move to Borussia Dortmund, who are famous for youth development, could be considered a really good move for him. And then one final option in this area is Quentin Merlin, who is a 21-year-old from Nantes in Liga. Now, Quentin Merlin has a slightly different profile to the other two in that he is an attacking fullback, but he's much more of a passer / crosser, but he's another one in that mold of players who you could have on the bench working their way into the team. Is at the right level, you could step up, and it would come down to what the recruitment department at Dortmund wanted in terms of specific profiles. But of course, there is a very obvious hole in the middle of this squad, and that is right here, because this is the area where Jude Bellingham was most recently playing for Dortmund. He is gone, and so the big question is, how are Dortmund going to fill that hole? They received over 100 million euros for him, so they have plenty of money in the kitty. The big question is, how do you replace what Jude Bellingham was giving to this team through the transfer market? And that is not an easy question to answer, because when you look at Jude Bellingham's data, this guy is very good. You can see all the way down green bars. He is good at every area. He's good in terms of the attacking play, the development of chances, also moving the ball down the field, and then defensively as well. Really, really good all the way across the board. And this shows up quite nicely in this graphic from Mark Carey of The Athletic. Now, this graphic shows you 3 different metrics. So what we're looking for is how Jude Bellingham contributes to these 3 areas. So progressive play, attacking contribution, and then defensive volume as well. And you can see Jude Bellingham is bang in the middle. That means he's helping out in each 3 of these areas equally. So what we're seeing from Jude Bellingham is a super well-rounded player. But it's important to remember that this data was gathered across the 22-23 season, and after the World Cup, Dortmund started playing in a very different style to the way they'd been playing before. And so if Edin Terzić, the Dortmund manager, wants to continue in this play style going forward, then we have to spend some time having a look at what Bellingham's role in that system was, so that we can find the right kind of player to replace him. So this is what Dortmund looked like on paper in the second half of the season. It's a 4-1-4-1 shape, or a 4-3-3 shape, however you like to label it. But this structure changes quite considerably in possession, because what we saw was Emre Can, the pivot player here, dropping in between the 2 centre-backs, giving a little bit more coverage in the back line, and this allows the fullbacks to get quite far forward. And because the width is now coming through these fullbacks, we can now move the wide forwards into a much more narrow configuration as well. So there's plenty of space for the wide players to get up and down, help out in the attacking phase, but also it brings your players much closer together, which allows interplay between them, which is good for Dortmund because they do have a lot of technical players on the field. But the other upside that you get from this is out of possession, because if you're going to try and counter press, because you have your players much closer together, that allows you to actually turn the ball over and then spring these more direct attacks straight out of these moments of turnover. So what does this mean for Bellingham? Well, in possession, there's a couple of things he can do. On the one hand, as you've seen, if Emre Can does decide to drop out, then there's a lot of space here in the pivot area that he can fall into and do a lot of deep lying playmaker stuff, so help progress the ball down the field with Can dropping out. But there's also a lot of scope for Bellingham to be involved in the attacking play as well, and Edin Terzić has really encouraged him to get forward, to be creative around the edge of the box, and actually to get into the box and score goals himself as well. And this means that he's doing much less defensive work than he was doing beforehand, because now out of possession what we're seeing is Emre Can sitting in this area and being the defensive destroyer. The fullbacks can drop in, and they often get quite narrow here. So what we end up seeing is more of a 4-5-1 shape, like this. And actually on the ball side, you'll often see the wide player dropping into the back line as well to make it almost a 5 at the back. So in these situations, Bellingham and Brandt now have a zonal responsibility with Emre Can, but rather than being out and out defenders, what you're expecting from them is for them to step up quite aggressively when opposition players carry the ball into their zone. And so rather than seeing Bellingham doing a lot of backwards defending and last ditch tackling, what we're seeing from him now is much more front foot oriented. He's using pressures in order to be able to control the opposition in their possession phase. And so when we're talking about replacing Jude Bellingham in this system, we're not necessarily looking for a completely well-rounded profile. We're actually looking for a player who's going to be able to add things going forward, who's going to be able to move the ball into the final third and then be dangerous in that final third, both creatively but also in terms of taking chances themselves. But one other important thing to note when trying to replace Jude Bellingham is his availability, because as you can see on this graphic, Bellingham is the most played teenager in Europe. So he's played over 5,400 minutes over the course of the last season, which is an incredible amount of minutes. And so when we're looking to replace Jude Bellingham, actually we probably can't just do it with one player. We should probably be looking at two. We should be looking at a starting player and then a youngster behind that starting player who can fill all of those minutes and just give you a little bit more depth in your squad. And so with all of that in mind, my suggestion for a sensible transfer to be the starting level player to replace Jude Bellingham is Lovro Majer of Stade Rennais. Now, Lovro Majer is basically Luka Modric if you made him slightly less good at everything, but that is obviously still an incredible play. He's 25 years old. He's been playing on the right side of a midfield three for Rennes. He can play on the left side as well, but that means that he knows this kind of position really well. And if we look at his data, he's just a wonderful player. So as we've already said, Bellingham played a really important role in Dortmund's attacking play, and as we can see, Lovro Majer does the same for Rennes. We can see that his underlying numbers in terms of goal scoring really impressive, so really nice non-penalty XG numbers. And it's not just in the box, it's around the edge of the box as well that he is offering a huge amount of upside. So we can see 97th percentile on assists, 96th percentile on expected assists, so we're getting a really nice rate of return there, and then 97th percentile on shot creating actions. So he's going to be adding a huge amount to Dortmund in terms of their attacking play. And then if we look at the next couple of metrics, we can see that Majer would be able to play that deep lying playmaker role that Bellingham has been doing in the team. Not only is he really good at progressive passes, but his progressive carries are great as well, so you'll be able to pick the ball up and help the team move it down the field as well. And then when it comes to the defensive side of the game, not quite so impressive as Bellingham, but still very impressive for the kind of player that he is. So you could definitely slot him into that role on the right-hand side of a midfield three, and he would be perfect. So Lovro Majer is my sensible transfer pick for the Jude Bellingham replacement at Borussia Dortmund. But we still need to find a backup player, maybe a younger profile, who could fill in for Lovro Majer if he wasn't available. And the first player that I want to suggest in that vein is Lazar Samardžić, who is playing for Udinese at the moment. But Samardžić is an interesting player because he is actually German-born, so he would count as a homegrown player. He's played at Hertha Berlin. He's also played at RB Leipzig as well before moving to Udinese, where he played last season. Now, Samardžić is a player who would be absolutely perfect at doing the final third stuff that you want from this kind of role, because if you look at his data, you can see he is a goal scorer, but he's also a goal creator as well. And he's created both in terms of open play, but also from set pieces. Now, Samardžić has been playing on the right side of a midfield three in a 3-5-2 shape for Udinese, and this is very similar to the sort of shape that Dortmund end up in when they're in possession. So in terms of that side of the role, he'd be perfectly suited. But if we actually look at his ball progression numbers, we can see that he's not quite at the same level that Lovro Majer is. Particularly when you look at the progressive passing number here, the data does suggest that he might struggle in that deeper lying playmaker role that Bellingham was playing. But it is important to note that he hasn't been playing that kind of role for Udinese, and it could be the case that if he's tasked with that responsibility, we actually see these numbers boost a little bit when he gets more space and time around the ball in a deeper area. Now, if you look at his defensive numbers, you can see it's not all that impressive, but as we've said, this role isn't about defensive volume, and so there's no real concern here. Now, Samardžić is only 21 years old, but he already has a wealth of experience playing football in the top 5 leagues in Europe, and so he would be a really good complement to Lovro Majer in that Jude Bellingham position. But there's perhaps another fun option that Dortmund could take here, and that is doing what they've done before and bringing in a player from the Manchester City Academy. And the player that I want to suggest here is Jon Mackenzie. So this is a tried and tested formula for Borussia Dortmund because they've already brought in young English players. They did that with Jude Bellingham. They've also brought players in from Manchester City's academy. They've done that with Jamie Bino-Gittens and Jadon Sancho. They also have a pretty good relationship when it comes to recruitment with Manchester City. So they've sold them Ilkay Gundogan, Erling Haaland and Manuel Akanji as well. So this seems on paper a really plausible bet. And Jon Mackenzie is a perfect candidate here because he is 20 years old. He's just coming off the back of a really good loan spell at Sheffield United, and his numbers from that spell are really quite nice. So as we can see, he is a goal scorer, he is a creative player, maybe not quite to the level that you would want, but as we've said, he's young, he's still developing. Now, the only possible area of concern is the same area of concern that we had with Samardžić, which is the ability to play that deeper lying playmaker role, because as we can see, his progressive passes number is not quite the level that you might want from someone dropping in and helping out with the build-up. But elsewhere, in terms of the final third production, we can see that his progressive carries are excellent. He's also passing the ball into the penalty area, so he's going to be offering a huge amount of attacking upside to Borussia Dortmund. And again, if we look at his defensive numbers, they're not all that impressive, but as we've already said, this isn't a really high defensive volume role, and so there's not too much of a concern there. Now, with all of these players, we haven't talked about the practicalities of their contracts, and that is because Dortmund have just sold Jude Bellingham for upwards of 100 million euros, and that means they could buy any combination of these 3 players, and to be honest, they could probably buy all 3 if they wanted to. So where does this leave us? Well, we've already picked Majer as our starting option to replace Jude Bellingham, and the big question then is which of these backups are we going to pick? Now, Jon Mackenzie has a really high ceiling. He is a Manchester City player after all, and there are rumours that Pep Guardiola might be using him in pre-season, so there's no question that he would be able to play at this level. But with Lazar Samardžić, we already have a player who's been playing at the highest level of European competition. He has a few seasons of experience in the top 5 leagues in Europe, and so because of this, Dortmund would be confident playing Samardžić as a starter from the off. And so because of this, I'm going to make Lazar Samardžić the backup to Lovro Majer in this replacement for Jude Bellingham. Now, losing Jude Bellingham would be devastating for any football club, but because of Dortmund's transfer policy and their willingness to develop youth from around Europe, they're probably better set up to navigate this process than anyone else.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.